Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a world in which the gritty world of Batman seems kind of realistic now, and that's a weird feeling. Anyway, we're also talking about Canadian literature and culture, and in this case, Native Americans or Indigenous populations.
Or First Nations, whatever you choose to call them.
All of the above.
Yes.
Whatever
they like to be called, actually.
Yes. So with me, as always, is my co-host, Mackenzie. How are you doing today? Even though we've been talking for like 45 minutes at this point, so I know exactly how you're doing.
I am fantastic. I live in a state of constant anxiety because of Vladimir Putin, and that's okay.
I wish... Yeah, we should. Yeah, we have a Ukraine episode. Yeah, I wish you were joking. But I feel like we also live in a world in which anxiety-inducing things just happen all the time. This is just the most recent one.
Well, I feel like it's more that we live in a world where our generation gets anxiety a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Anxiety-inducing things were happening before. It's just we're the ones that are feeling it. Or we're the first ones that actually get labeled as anxiety instead of just being told that we're being wusses.
Yes, and like
or
people
sensitive.
Actually talk about it.
Yeah. It's not that our generation is more anxious. We're just talking about it for once.
Yeah, and previous generations were sent to madhouses. But anyway, moving on. Today,
speaking of which, the treatment of First Nations people.
Mad world. So today we're going to be, I guess, kind of covering part one of a mini-series, if you will, or at least it's going to lead into our next episode, I think, pretty seamlessly. So the intent here is to talk, or at least provide a bit of an outline about various prairie indigenous cultures, which we haven't really talked about so far. We talked a little bit about the Métis a few episodes ago, but we mostly, in our purview so far, have talked about British Columbia and Eastern Canada. We haven't really talked about everything in between. So, except for obviously that one episode of Pop Canada in which we talked about the Klondike Gold Rush, which you can pay $3 a month to see, and it's great.
$3 a month?
Yep.
For a whole extra hour of content?
Per month, absolutely.
Wow.
Anyway, absolutely seamless plug aside. So the idea here is to be able to talk about a bit of the indigenous populations that are on the prairies. And specifically, I wanted to look at it from the purview of how these populations adapted to the arrival of settler populations from Europe. Because I do think that it is a bit different than what you see in Eastern Canada. Right. Mostly because when Eastern Indigenous populations, encountered Europeans, a lot of them were wiped out. Right. I think some conservative estimates indicate of 60-70% of the population was wiped out, something like that. This is entirely off of memory, but I could be wrong on this, but a significant portion of it was eliminated. And while you see similar things in the prairies, what you also see is, I think, a really interesting adaptation of their culture to the arrival of settler populations. So I want to talk a little bit about that and finish on how settler populations represented through their own culture these native populations, which will touch upon the reasons why they did that. And that will hopefully lead us into our next episode, which I won't spoil here, but it will be a doozy. So
it's going to be something, man. Every time we step up to the plate and talk about First Nations or historical people of color, etc., every time I'm like, okay, well, this going to be the one where we say something we really shouldn't.
So that's kind of the reason why I'm limiting the purview of what we're talking about. Because...
But it's like the next episode is going to be the big one for that, you know?
Yes, I believe so as well. But also just we know very little about how populations lived in, early North America before contact, right?
Plus
just
because we killed them all.
We killed a lot of them, and also because there were no written records or little written records. So it's a lot of oral records. And like you say, a lot of these people who had knowledge died. So... And it's not the same type of knowledge that is kept.
We burned the rest of the knowledge down.
Sure. But it's also
burning people.
I also don't I also feel like a lot of the Indigenous people who would know about this stuff and their ways of life, I entirely encourage listeners to actually reach out to those people or listen to their own medias about their own stories. That's kind of why I don't want to be a downer on every episode that we talk about Indigenous populations. There's a lot of great stuff that comes out of their artwork, and we've talked about it before, right? But
no, I think we definitely should still be talking about it,
yes,
like just being afraid of saying something wrong isn't a reason to not say it at all.
No, but I do think there's a reason behind the way that we're talking about it, right? Because I want to leave room for people who are from those communities to speak, right?
And to tell us that we're wrong.
Yeah, obviously. Speaking of which, if listeners have anything to add to the show, always reach out with an email. Yeah. But by the way, when we're talking about plains today, we're basically talking about most of the modern provinces from Manitoba to Alberta.
Wait, we're not talking about like the kind of plain?
Yes. So you didn't know, but pre-contact, a lot of Indigenous populations in those provinces and in those areas had access to motorized vehicles.
They had their pilot's license, actually.
Yes, absolutely. Before they even had horses, they had planes.
Guys, Apache helicopters? Come on. It's so easy to see.
Damn it. And there's the cancel button right there.
No, we're talking about the plains like Saskatchewan,
right,
Manitoba, and Alberta.
Yeah, pretty much. So pretty much from the end of Ontario up until the Rocky Mountains.
The middle of Canada.
Yeah. So that's a huge area to cover. But as we'll see, like these types of populations moved around a lot. And a lot of it was just, was inhabited by a relatively small population that actually moved with the food, as we'll see. Yeah, so in terms of various Indigenous populations, we see in this section people like the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Dakota, or the Stoney, all kinds of populations like this, a lot of which were small bands of travelers. There were very few compared to what you see, for example, in like Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee populations in Eastern Canada. You saw very little like massive conglomerations of these populations. Right? They often stayed in relatively small groups and moved around. So before the epidemics of the early 1800s that would wipe across, the eastern, the Western Plains, as they did in Eastern Canada, it's estimated that there were about 33,000 Indigenous people in that section, right? Which is why I say, like, considering the size of the territory that we're talking about today, it's a relatively small population, right? Yeah. In terms of when they arrived, we estimate that it was at least 11,000 years ago. But again, it's difficult to say because some things were destroyed or didn't stand the test of time. So as best we can guess, that's when the plains populations started, hunting and establishing themselves across these areas.
Right.
What do you know actually about like the way of life of a lot of peoples here, if any?
I know on a relatively the same as what a lot of people would know. Again, because I know what I was taught, and I know a bit more about the reality.
Sure.
And I live in a gray area between the two.
Okay. And what were you taught exactly?
For the plains?
Yeah.
Well, I know that a lot of the words like nomadic.
Yeah.
What's the one, shield? Or is that, no?
The Canadian Shield? That's not, that's a mountain range.
Oh, there you go. Exactly. There's the limit of my knowledge. No, but I know, about the nomadic lifestyle, how the nomadic lifestyle worked for them, their main sources of, say, sustenance, like we're going to talk about later, bison.
Yep.
The extinction of which was a major blow to them.
Yeah, I'm actually, while you're talking, I'm flipping through a book that I wanted to refer to a bit because I know there's an image that leads in directly to like the extinction of the bison that you're talking about. But
I also know that like just because they were nomadic didn't mean that they had routes planned out, that they lived in isolation in any way or any of those things. They were, we've seen trade routes going all the way from Alaska to the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We know that there are these like large and interconnected series of paths, territories, and so on and so forth. So, we say nomadic lifestyle, but they still lived in an area that was like, they knew the area, they were living there. It's not like they went wherever they wanted.
No, and that's mostly because of like the restrictions of the time, obviously. Like, as we'll see, the horse actually only came later in the lives of a lot of these populations from South America. And so prior to that, you had to either travel by canoe, right, or by foot.
Dog sled,
if you were more up north, right?
Yeah.
Although I don't know, I actually didn't find anything. I don't know if, like, outside of Inuit populations, like how many indigenous populations.
Probably not many.
Right.
Even if you're in a place that has a bit more snow, it just wouldn't make sense to carry. At least I don't see like a lot of logic behind having that equipment and set up for if you're just trying to go along the water, the plain. Sorry.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Dumb.
But it's interesting because I've been reading a book recently called The Dawn of Everything, which just came out, I think, last year.
Nice.
And it actually talks a lot about indigenous cultures, or like pre-colonized cultures, a bit across the world and in North America as well. And the authors bring up exactly the point that you're bringing, is like, we have this image of indigenous populations as staying relatively within their areas, which to an extent is true.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of evidence to say, like, no, there was a lot of contact, and people moved around a lot more than we like to give them credit for. Right. And so even intercultural contact was a thing that was done, right? Inuit populations, for example, came down south sometimes, and it took a long time, but it happened. Like, people would just travel, and they assumed that it would take, a lot longer than perhaps traveling by horse, or what we now know as like a car or whatever. Right. So
wait, without mechanized transportation, it takes a while to get places.
Yeah, who knew, right?
I also know that the belief that, like, this common held belief that Europe was far, far advanced in technology isn't exactly true.
No, exactly. It also, you kind of have to, exactly.
It's so unbelievably different in that way of life. Like, yeah, they may not have had, I don't know, guns.
Sure.
But that's because it wasn't part of their lifestyle to, like, ravage the land for that.
Mm-hmm.
Their knowledge is more, again, working with the land.
Yeah.
Proper maintenance of nature is something that we definitely don't have them. Like, their knowledge and the proper maintenance and conservation of nature is still light years ahead of what we're doing today a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think your point of where like what Europe was like at the time of colonization is like really well taken, because think of, like, for example, when Christopher Columbus arrived, Europe was barely coming out of the Middle Ages, right? The High Middle Ages, but like Columbus was still very much like a medieval thinker in many ways. But it's like the Middle Ages were not that advanced in many ways, and like,
No.
I wouldn't necessarily qualify it as like light years ahead of...
That's the other part. People don't understand, like, the concept. It's one of those things where people don't really, like, the misunderstanding or the misconception of history and what time periods were like,
Absolutely.
Like that conception of the pyramids being built so long ago and how the sort of evolution, the changes. Or it's like when people are talking about the relative closeness of the moon landing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we started flying, like, first flying machines, like, early 20th century.
Yep.
60 years later, boom, we're on the moon.
Yeah.
And people, it's that little conception that people just don't get how technology will explode like that.
Exactly.
It booms and it busts, and we were in a bust with the medieval age.
Yeah, and in part because people were able to come over to North America and exploit the hell out of them.
Yeah.
Right. So
steal the resources.
And right. But anyway, to come back to our topic in this case, we can hit upon this idea of like technology or uses of techniques, right, in relation to the bison, where bison hunting, as you were saying, was the main source of sustenance, right? And for thousands,
main source of everything.
The main source of everything, right?
Like they did not leave a single part of the bison behind.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you used its furs for winter, you used its bones to support structures. Like,
that's my favorite way of living. Like, leave nothing behind. Like, leave nothing for granted.
Boy, what a world! Imagine living in such a world in which waste was not.
Or when waste was not so readily available, or living in such a climate where we had to waste things. We had to buy the packaging all the time.
Anyway, There's another anxiety-inducing checkbox right there.
My climate anxiety's back, you guys.
Oh, look, it replaced Putin for a while.
Oh, now it's Putin again.
There you go.
What's going to get us back to the First Nations plain living?
So for several thousands of years, right, the way that this people hunted bison was through spears, right? And horses hadn't arrived yet. So it was mostly on foot.
Well, so there was actually, this is something I do know about. They didn't just use spears. They had a special throwing mechanism for their spears.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I didn't look into that.
Yeah, it was almost like an extra stick or an extra mechanism. So that way, when they pulled back with their arm, they could launch even further and harder. Like there was more snap to their throw.
Right. So it was kind of like a stringless form of a bow kind of thing?
Yeah, or almost like a slingshot, but with sticks and pointy parts.
Oh, okay. Like now that you mention that, I think I've seen something like that in a museum before, and I've never. I didn't think of it, but that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. But like again, that's kind of cool. And when we're thinking about when you were saying technology, I would definitely put that in the realm of technology.
Exactly. Like it was their own
extension
kind of
of man, right? Or the extension of people, right?
They just don't get it.
But actually, speaking of bows, like those would actually emerge around the year 100 to 200, right? In what is now southern Saskatchewan or Alberta. Again, the dates are a bit fuzzy here because something made of wood like a bow would not.
Atlatla.
Okay.
Atlatl. That's the thing that they were using for the spear throwing.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. Well, again, makes sense. And shows obviously just like the adaptations that people were going through, right? And how people adapted to their environments in order to, in this case, hunt one of the only things that existed in this area to eat. Right?
That would provide enough food to eat, because again, you're living on a plain. It's not a forest. It's not like you can just go hunting for rabbits a lot. It's a plain.
Mm-hmm. Although you did see what was kind of interesting. You did see agriculture form in like small, again, it kind of goes against this myth that we have that they were purely nomadic, these peoples. That there were small forms of agriculture that were done, right?
Which honestly, now that I start to consider it, they had
of course
small farming. They need vegetables. my brain is like, it's the small things where we get, again, you put a little bit of logic on the point of, okay, they didn't just eat bison meat. They needed to get their vitamins and everything else like we did.
Yeah,
and they can only do so much gathering.
This is again something that's brought up in that book I mentioned earlier, where it's like it kind of demonstrates a lot of a profound lack of the imagination sometimes when we imagine human societies in like very strict categories, right? As either civilized, quote unquote, civilized and agricultural, right? Centered around cities, or purely nomadic. And often nomadic people are imagined as like very egalitarian. Right. But like, you can look through a lot of societies in history, including the ones we're talking about today, and say like, no, there was more complexity. Sometimes people stopped and farmed for a bit. And just because they moved around a lot doesn't mean there weren't chiefs who actually had like power.
Yeah.
So
power structures and systems existed. Surprise.
Exactly. So I do find it interesting to think about this and how, again, plains societies are not just like every other indigenous society or any other society, period, are not like a uniform mass of nomadic people who, were profoundly equal. Right.
I also think it's indicative of how we've moved on and how we view these things, because yes, nomadic people moved around a lot, but it's not to say that we weren't moving around a lot. Again, going back to the medieval period, crops rotation was a thing.
Yep.
That's its own kind of, it's not a fully nomadic lifestyle because you still return to the manor or the house, but you're not staying in the same place, people.
No.
It's only now that we're doing that because we have industrialized cities and it's easier for us to stay in the same place and sit around.
Yeah. And like the rise of monoculture and stuff like that.
Except for old people that are snowbirds.
Oh, yeah. Which I aspire to.
I aspire to have wealth as well. We may hate the capitalist system, but we shall participate in it.
I mean, yep. Anyway, so, but to come back to the ways in which they hunted. So you were bringing up the Atlatl. I guess that's how you'll pronounce it.
Atlatl.
But they also, again, to kind of come back to the idea of movement. Obviously, I don't know if listeners have ever actually seen a buffalo move. Despite its speed, those things can run.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you catch something like that? Right. And one of the ways in which that was done was to either corral them, similar to how you actually will do with cows today, right? Just kind of force them into a pen, right?
Corral.
Exactly. Or
Yeehaw!
this is something that you saw a lot. They were literally hunted down and forced to jump off cliffs. Right. So, which is, I've heard before, but it's also, I was thinking about this before starting to record the episode. I was like, damn, that must be some messy business though, to have to deal with after. But again, just using the environment that you have to your advantage in this case. Yeah. Right. So yeah, they would
what else was messy to deal with? The plague.
Yes.
We all have messes to deal with.
And COVID anxiety. So,
and keep going.
No, go ahead.
Never mind. But no, it's this belief, like you say, there's this mess to deal with. Mm-hmm. But if you do these things properly, there's a lot in which there's a lot less mess than you think.
Yeah. And I don't know, like the information I found was like, oh, they were driven off a cliff, right, to jump. But you don't need that high of a cliff in order to kill a bison, probably.
To be perfectly honest, you probably just needed to drive it off far enough where it would break its legs.
Yep.
And then you can kill it.
Yep. Exactly. So
it's not like they were making a jump off of a 100-foot cliff onto sharp rocks to impale it.
No.
Because they also understood that would be inhumane and painful for the bison. Mm-hmm. They took what they needed to survive, but they also probably made it as painless as possible.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I would imagine so, but why would you make it suffer more than it needs to be? So, and just in terms of food, right? That meat was actually often dried through wind, through wind and fire, and it was actually mixed with berries, right, or fat, and could therefore be stored for the winter. Ooh. Which again makes perfect sense. You don't want anything to go to waste, right? So you dry it, as with a lot of things. And as I mentioned, right, this would still be the main source of sustenance for a lot of populations in the prairies and the plains until Europeans arrived, right? And there was some agriculture, but it was still nomadic bison hunting that ruled.
Bison hunting! Yeah. Represent.
So any kind of, permanent village or settlement in terms of agriculture, you saw pretty much similar things to what you find here, mostly centered around a waterway. And you grew corn, you grew squash, and you stayed near lakes, for example. And so you could hunt fish, for example. So pretty much similar to what you saw, right? And naturally, during those winter seasons that I was mentioning, this is where you saw a lot of populations or bands, conglomerate back together, right? Because you're not moving as much during the winter. Right? You still move a bit to obviously hunt, but not as much. And there's always strength in numbers during those times. By the way, I don't know where I was going with that. By the way, nothing.
Fine.
So, in terms of horses, right? Because prairie people would actually later be known as quite adept horse riders, right? And this is something that, for example, populations like the Métis would use a lot. So they would actually begin to appear on the Canadian prairies in the beginning of the 18th century, with some estimates saying about the 1720s.
Okay,
right?
That's cool.
And this is actually before permanent white settlers arrived, right? In a lot of places. Yes, you maybe had fur traders here and there that maybe went in that far, but by and large, you didn't really have white settlers yet. But what you did have were horses, which did come from white settlers in many ways, right?
So wait, where did horses come from?
So as far as I know, they came from Asia, right? They evolved from Asia, and then Europeans adopted them. And then the Spanish, when they colonized South America, brought some horses over, which kind of then grew up and became indigenous, or at least transplanted into what would become South America, right? And eventually, some of them went wild and would eventually make their way up north. So literally, domestic horses re-became wild in the colonies and were re-domesticated by plains peoples.
Hilarious. I love that.
Which is kind of cool.
Well, it's almost kind of fascinating how they were able to do that, like without all the crazy shit.
What do you mean?
That we normally assume with domesticating, you know?
Right. I don't know. Like, I don't know how they went about domesticating the horses or anything like that. But yeah, I guess, and it doesn't seem to have taken that long, right? Because if the Spanish arrived, say, okay, in the 1500s, brought horses, so it takes a couple hundred years for them to arrive, I guess, up north. It wouldn't have taken particularly long for them to re-domesticate them compared to, for example, dogs and cats that took often hundreds of years to domesticate properly. Right.
Yeah.
And cats are still not fully domesticated, as evidenced by the million scratches that I have on my arm.
Yo, cats domesticated us. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Like, this is like, it's not even a joke.
Right.
It's an actual thing that they did.
Explain yourself.
Me?
Yes.
It's like cats don't really provide a positive function as far as a reason for domestication, because we domesticate animals to fulfill a need.
I don't know if they hunt mice.
No, but again, like we had dogs for that originally. Like that's what, like originally, when we were domesticating animals, ones we ride, ones we use for hunting or scouting, you know, birds, canines, etc. Cats domesticated us insofar that they realized we were a good source of food, so they made them, like, they wormed their way into our households.
I've never heard that before, but that, knowing how cats act, I would not be surprised.
There's like a whole thing about it, and about, I'm doing it misjustice, but there's a whole thing of like a chemical that they give off and all this sorts of shit.
Oh, interesting.
It's so freaky.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'm interested in knowing more about that after, actually. But yeah, so obviously when we're thinking about horses, it does, much like it did in South America and in Europe and literally everywhere, it sparks a cultural revolution in many ways, right? It kickstarts the ability to travel even further distances much faster. And in terms of our purview here with plains populations, hell, you can hunt bison much more efficiently now. Apparently bison were more endurant than horses, however. So it was still not fully dominating, but you still had the ability to hunt them down without expending that much energy.
Right.
Right. So, and also in terms of cultural connections and stuff like that, this is something that we'll touch upon a little bit later. It allowed bands to meet up and to actually pool their resources together much more efficiently as well. And so often during these times, you had bands that were sometimes as large as 200 people that were able to be formed, because suddenly you can merge up with a bunch of populations that perhaps you didn't see as often. And hey, now you can hunt or, play or do whatever you want together.
Hunting's hard though.
That's true. And that's why you have a horse, to make it less hard.
Yay.
Right. So, horses, in a way, were kind of a valued servant, obviously, like we were saying, for the buffaloes. But actually, it created kind of a whole new way of living. And the agricultural element definitely started to play a bit more of a role in this case, because now you could travel faster to areas that perhaps had better soil or better land in it. And, you could use horses to put to pasture and stuff like that. So, and you saw the rise of what would kind of be considered a shepherd in many ways, or horse raising, and etc. So there were kind of changes that were happening. What was the O for? What was the O for?
Just for like the horse shepherds and stuff.
Oh yeah, okay. So
that's kind of cool.
In terms of structure, right, the actual societal structure that we're talking about, like I was saying,
anarchy. Obviously, that's what the textbooks told me.
Well, no, not quite. But see, again, to come back to the dawn of everything, an interesting point that they make in that book is like, people often associate indigenous populations with egalitarian societies, but it's a bit more accurate to say free societies, right? Whereas like you did have hierarchies in many ways, and like certain people did certain things, and there were chiefs, right? But for example, chiefs in the prairie populations only held respect and the support of their populations as long as they were successful in their quests for food and in defense against enemy attacks, right? And so these relations of power only existed insofar as, you could actually convince the rest of your band that you were a good leader. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, there were many cases noted, and this is by, you see this in a lot of missionary writings, for example, of bands just kind of ignoring what their leaders say. So that's in that sense where it's a bit more free. They acknowledge that there's a leader, but you don't have to respect their decisions if you think it's a bad one, right? Okay. Which I think is kind of cool. Right.
It's neat.
It's a neat way, I think, of reconsidering this.
Oh, for sure, 100%
of equality versus freedom, because it's not the same thing.
No,
right?
It's not.
Okay, I thought you were going to finish.
No, I'm trying to I'm trying to. How do I say this? How do I say this right? Because again, we're trying to impose our idea of a Western thought or structure onto something that was like totally different from that,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like it is so far beyond just being egalitarian versus free.
Yeah.
Free is a much better word simply because it's much broader and it fits much more with what we actually, what we're actually thinking about, because it fits more of this idea that it's not just, there's no, we don't have a system that we can just set on it that we draw from.
Right.
So free is a better word simply because it has a broader definition.
It has a broader definition, and I think how could I say this? I think it opens up, I guess as an extension of being a broader definition, it opens up more possibilities, I think, for imagining different societies or the way that societies operated, exclusive, outside of just what we see as European norms. Right.
Right.
But yeah, so that's just kind of, the overview again. And then as Europeans kind of trickled in and eventually just poured into the West with the arrival of the 18th and 19th centuries and 20th centuries, obviously you saw similar things to what you saw in Eastern Canada or in British Columbia, wherein you saw a massive upheaval in buffalo hunting. And I couldn't find the picture I was talking about in the book, but I'll describe it to you, wherein there was no respect of the ability to say, hey, we need to be careful about how many of these we hunt because or else we're going to die. Right. But instead, because you're trying to fulfill the needs of a fur market, you just kill all of them. Right. And there are pictures there. The picture I was looking for, I'll describe it to you, was literally in Saskatchewan, a wall of buffalo bones that was formed because of overhunting. Right. And so you just ended up with these literally miles long walls of bones that were just hunted at the same time. Right. And so, of course, what happens when you're just doing these kinds of practices is eventually people starve and your way of life is threatened. And so it kind of forces you to adopt new cultural practices that are not your own necessarily, because, hey, suddenly if I can't hunt buffalo, guess what? I'm not going to be able to hunt at all. It kind of changes, obviously, the way that people operate. It's a really haunting image. I'll try to find it, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I can't have buffalo. What the fuck am I supposed to do?
Well, in this case, your options are to change, right? Or, it's not really an option, but a lot of people also died of diseases and malnutrition, right?
You gotta think of it. And for people who are wondering, just change. It's change. It's so easy to change it. Look at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
Was it really so easy for people to change to be I can't order stuff from the grocery store and have it delivered. I need to go to the grocery store. I need to go to, it's no. It's obviously not that easy to just change.
No. And speak of anyone and if you want to bring it back to cultural practices, just as soon as you're talking about, and you see it, for example, right now, I've had these conversations with people about Ukrainians, right? Imagine this, right? And again, very tenuous way. It's not quite the same thing here, but where the Canadian government is talking about helping a lot of Ukrainians emigrate to Canada, right? And what's the first thing that you hear? It's a threat to the way of life here because suddenly you're imposing a bunch of new people who can't necessarily integrate properly, right? And the Canadian lifestyle is threatened. right? And you hear the same thing about all kinds of populations. And so it kind of, you see this whole idea often of, well, yeah, it's not easy to change, right?
No.
But
like
people
if it was so easy to change, we wouldn't have a climate crisis.
Right. Yeah.
If it was so easy to change, most of the world, like humanity, we don't change. It's one of our defining features, both for the good and the bad. People, it's what given the people the strength to resist in the most trying of times.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I feel like that's kind of what's interesting with looking at these early populations, right? Indigenous from Canada or otherwise, is like what you see a lot of times is like an intrinsic ability to change, though, right? With the seasons, with food availabilities, and so you see society structures change.
We used to, but now with globalization, we don't do that so much more.
That's what I'm saying. Is like, so you kind of lost this ability in many ways, right? It's not necessarily human nature. It's the way that we're acting right now. Right? So I don't know. That's not a question that we're going to be able to answer in this episode, but it is something to consider that I think
I'm
is
not
interesting.
smart enough for that.
So yeah, like I said, pretty much what we're describing is a similar affair of contact that you saw in Eastern Canada. However, there is like one major difference that I want to point to. And it's around the 19th century that you also see the systematization, yes, of treaty making, right? We talked a little bit about this when we talked about treaties, right? And the evolution of how they happened pre-Confederation. But in a post-Confederation world, right, you start to see an actual structure to the way that treaties are made, right, between the Canadian government and Indigenous populations.
Oh, treaties!
And it's the prairies and the Indigenous populations that are living there that would kind of be almost I don't want to say test run, but they would be the ones who would first get what we call the numbered treaties, right? Which are the quote unquote official ones that the Canadian government would enact as Canada, right, after Confederation. And obviously these treaties, which displaced all, if not all Indigenous populations on the prairies, were obviously integral to the construction of the railway, which is going to be the subject of an episode soon.
Oh, the railway.
that wonderful.
That fucking railway. God damn it.
Again, great in some respects, but then you see this part and you're like, oh, okay.
God damn it.
Do you have anything to add here before we get into like cultural elements?
About what?
Just like the overview that we were doing now, or anything.
If
any of
you
the
found any of this interesting, please go to a legitimate source of information.
Yes, of course. Like I said, go ahead.
I don't know. I just think this. I love talking about how cultures form and how they sort of play off of each other, and how like you see a progression of a culture based on certain things, based on the environment, how the environment affected them, and so on. I just think that's a really fast. I love that part of history. Yeah. Watching how culture comes to be is really cool, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of cultural practices, right, and we'll get into more now of the section in which we talk about how certain practices and cultural elements, lifestyles changed or adapted to the arrival of Europeans, right? And so I want to talk about two in particular in relation to the Indigenous populations, what we know is the powwow, and later what we know as ghost dance. Right? So the powwow is something that we probably have heard a million times, and is a practice whose origins are debated, right? But by and large, it refers to a common or a grouping, right, that is formed of various sizes in order to celebrate and to have fun, right? Or to practice perhaps religious aspects. Right? So a lot, there are some claims, and which is why I bring it up, that some of the Plains First Nations in Canada were the ones who kind of created many of the powwow dances that we know during this time, during the 19th century.
What is a powwow?
So it's this idea, there are many forms of it, which we'll talk about, but there are basically three types that you can see.
All right.
There are like private ones between just in a band, right? In which
what is a powwow? Like, what do they do with this powwow? Is it a verb? Is it an event?
It's an event. Yes. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Right. It's an event in which people gather, dance, and share food, perform ceremonies, etc.
Okay, so it's like a sort of like broad. It's almost to use a Western term, almost festival of some kind or celebration.
Yeah, in a sense, right? Now, again, this is something that with the arrival of the horse, for example, would be facilitated, right? Which is why a lot of people kind of point to the modern or contemporary version of the powwow as emerging in the 19th century, right? In which many bands could more easily group together and perform these ceremonial dances together. So like we were saying, there have been 3 that have been often pointed to today. Private ones that take place or now take place on reserves, for example, or near reserves, and are usually intended only for members of a band, right? Or a tribe that come together and perform a certain ceremony that's important to them. You can also have powwows that are actually inclusive of non-Indigenous communities. And that's something that's a bit more recent as a phenomenon. Right? And it's kind of it kind of exists to demonstrate Indigenous practices to non-Indigenous people. And you also there have also been ones that have been identified as like the annual summer powwows, right? And usually these are much larger. They happened in July or August. And these can bring, again, people from all across the spectrum, and they tend to be much larger, right? And much more imposing. And often you have religious ceremonies that are associated to it that are not exactly intended only for the powwow, but that can happen simultaneously to them. What's kind of interesting is that some people or some anthropologists have established or claimed that a lot of these powwows, or at least in the modern sense, that it kind of emerged as a mode of resistance to settler encroachment, of the idea of bringing together a community and finding a kind of strength in cultural numbers, if you will, right? Okay. Of ensuring the survival of your society, of your band, of your culture, by specifically coming together in order to practice things that were deliberately under threat, right?
Oh, okay.
And which is, again, something that we should keep in mind going into the next episode, because surprise, surprise, that hint, hint piece of legislation that we're going to be talking about is specifically going to affect things like the powwow.
We're talking about the Indian Act.
Yes.
No need to beat around the bush on that one.
No, but that's, yeah, exactly. So it would specifically, with that in mind, that it was a mode of bit of resistance, whether it was intended as such or not. That's kind of what, that's something that would be perceived as such. So just a bit on the powwows themselves. There's actually, when we were talking about like the dances and ceremonies that were performed there, what's interesting is that you kind of had a mix of traditional dances that were performed, for example, like the grass dance, which was meant for warriors and was a way to give strength to people and to praise prosperity in a sense, right? And strength of a community. But you also had competitive ones, right? And those were actually gender or age specific. And they had intention, so you'd actually literally have dance-offs in a sense. Like, nice. It's a bit of an oversimplification in this case, but that's kind of the idea.
Still, it's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And yeah, the entire idea is that whether or not there were these categories, again, what you saw through these dancings, and I'm pulling from one of the articles that I read about this, which will be linked, is what you saw is in powwow dancing, there was a kind of power that was manifested as both as like physical, as social, and spiritual. Right? It was simultaneously an individual thing and a communal thing. So, right, if you can see this in the competitive nature of it, where like you're trying to show that you have these specific capacities, but it's also a way to bring people together and to see that your community is doing well, right? Is having fun together. Right. And so this would also be a way of establishing relations between bands, obviously, relations of peace sometimes, or of establishing reciprocity or exchanges to ensure good health. So again, very similar to what you see in many cultures, but this one takes on specific forms through dancing in particular.
Yeah. Again, other cultures have similar with their own, like, what is it? The ancient Nordic poetry face-offs.
Oh, right.
Or even in Anglo-Saxon, Beowulf has a whole thing about Beowulf fighting a guy with song or something, doesn't he?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, yeah, it's basically a Norse like rap battle.
Yeah, it's a Norse rap battle. Dance-offs and rap battles have existed for a long time.
And oh my god, an old
haiku poetry slams.
Can you imagine what an old English rap battle would look like, just from like Beowulf's perspective?
If you ever really make a proper Beowulf movie, if you don't have a rap battle, it's not a proper Beowulf movie.
I'd have to find, like, I know my Beowulf copy is somewhere, but I do want to look into that now because that sounds dope.
Yeah. Again, it's not like the powwow definitely had some very specific things that made it very First Nations, but it's not like it was, it's all still culture. It's all still just like, it's not some super magical thing.
No, but although, like I was saying, like there were some dances, for example, that were associated sometimes with the powwow that happened at the same time that were
for sure. I mean more in the fact, when people, because again, conceptions and misconceptions in the mind of what a powwow is.
Yeah.
It's a lot of like the point of it is very similar to a lot of what we still do or what we used to do.
Right. Absolutely. So for example, like one of the religious things that I was referring to is like sometimes you had one that I was reading about was like the Sundance, which was like this really long ritual. It lasted many days. And it focused on constructing a literal sacred connection with a higher power, in this case, like the life-giving, like sun in many ways. The dances that were associated with it simultaneously represented captivity and escape, right? And a form of self-torture that then gives rise to a certain kind of freedom, right? So it's a bit of a complex one, and I'm sure I'm not doing it justice, but those are the types of dances that I was referring to as like providing an emotional and religious experience, right? That, can also have a greater social meaning.
I getcha.
So one that I wanted to specifically mention before we move on to the representations of settlers, by settlers of Indigenous populations, is the ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance is something that we have a video of, which I'll link to in the description. I don't know if you had a time to look into it a bit at the clip that I linked in the notes, but this is something that was created in the States and that did appear sometimes in Canada. But again, things like the Indian Act, which we'll talk about, definitely reacted against it, even though it didn't happen as much in Canada. Right? Have you ever actually heard of the ghost dance? I'm curious.
No. Anytime I hear of something that would be called the ghost dance, it would be in a very different context.
Right. But yeah, it's only recently that I heard about it when I was reading a book. I was like, oh, this looks interesting. And
well, I'm sort of looking at the reason that you've listed for it. This idea of spirits would be raised, buffalo return, etc. It's kind of like saying a prayer.
Yes.
Or
but the thing is, like, and this kind of shows, links back to what I was saying of adapting culture to a kind of survival mechanism in a sense, or like in the face of needing to survive, you change culture, you change your cultural practices, because this specifically emerged in response to colonization and settler practices, right? So as Mac was saying, I've seen it described differently. Some people describe it as a religion, others as what I wrote it down as here is a world renewal practice. And the whole point of this dance was to basically, as you said, convene with spirits and have them metaphorically or realistically be raised, right, from the dead. And as you're saying, right, this applied to buffalo as well, the idea of bringing them back to the land. And specifically, it also is a dance that would be, that would hopefully drive European settlers away. The there was actually also, I read this and I didn't look further into it, but like some Dakota or Sioux tribes believed that actually what they wore in that moment during the dance would also protect them from bullets. Right, which takes the idea of a ghost to a whole new level, I think, or like a really interesting level as something that haunts you from beyond the grave. Right. But yeah, I find that very interesting to think about how these cultural practices just kind of are created, right. In the face of survival. And so in the US and in Canada as well, like I'm saying, a lot of governments would try to ban the ghost dance because they believed, similar to how powwows were restricted, they believe that it would lead to uprisings, right?
And kids and their powwows and their ghost dances and their rock and roll and their
right. But again, it just goes to show the power of culture, of cultural.
Goes to show how we haven't changed.
That too, but it's also like the idea of like, oh, these people are getting together, and what happens if they get together and perform dances that explicitly attack us as settlers? Well, then we feel threatened.
It's also just an idea of, like, if we were them and we were meeting together, it'd be because for this reason.
Yeah.
Therefore, that has to be the reason that they're doing, implanting this idea, this belief that we have just because it's something that we would do.
Yeah. And to be fair, like there were some uprisings by Indigenous populations, as we've talked about before.
No shit, because they're getting attacked.
But I don't think there has been any there have been any links created specifically between the ghost dance and those uprisings. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And so Canada also would perform these would put in place these restrictions. And in fact, the police would often take steps to discourage its practice in Canada, even though it was already limited. And by the way, quick segue, the police are something that we're going to actively talk about because they were explicitly created in the prairie provinces to restrict Indigenous populations as well.
Right.
So that's something that we should keep in our minds moving forward. Anything else you want to add about this before we head into some of the representations?
Of what? The ghost dance?
Ghost dance, powwow, whatever.
Gosh, I think I'm good.
All right. So the last thing I want to talk about for today is a very famous artist in Canadian art, in the Canadian art canon, if you will.
Canadian art.
Is a man from Ireland called Paul Kane, who arrived in Toronto in 1819 when he was 9 years old, and who studied as a young person portraits and portrait painting. And he would eventually go back to Europe for a bit, and he would practice his painting style. And he would actually befriend a certain George Catlin, right, who had actually made his fame and fortune by producing paintings of Native American tribes in the U.S., right? And so Catlin was kind of known as providing a kind of documentary evidence of what was known as the quote unquote disappearing Indian, right? Because there was this idea at the time that the Indigenous population was doomed to disappear.
Right.
And this is an idea that would continue for well into the 20th century. This idea that natives are a dying species, and that, that people like George Catlin and, as we'll see now, Paul Kane are the people who will document the existence of these people before they go extinct.
They're a dying species.
That's okay.
As if they aren't human.
That's I agree, but that's the terms that again.
I know. It's not your fault. I just love the rhetoric that we have for this.
Yeah, it's terrible. And I hate it. But, such is Canada. So after his meeting with Catlin, Paul Kane would actually be determined to do the same thing with Indigenous populations in Canada. Mm-hmm. And the result would be a 3-year journey from Toronto to Vancouver, right, in which he would produce about 100 paintings from that were based on sketches that he made during his travels. Right? And several hundred of them are, and many of them are still in existence today. We can still find them. And as I linked in the show notes for you to see, we still know exactly what they looked like. Mm-hmm. And so for a long time, Kane was kind of seen as a documentarian, in many ways. And again, for listeners who are listening to the show, I will link to the images that we're looking at today. And one in particular, which you'll find on the first page, Mac, is called Assiniboine Hunting Buffalo.
Yeah, this one's cool.
It's
nice
cool.
Action shot.
Okay, so describe to me what you're seeing here, because I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are about. Because
I'm seeing Assiniboine hunting buffalo.
Okay, but is there
they're riding horses and they're hunting buffalo?
Is it
a singular buffalo? Not many. This is not a herd.
Yeah. Is it a realistic thing, you feel?
I wouldn't know, honest to God.
But I'm asking you personally, do you think it looks realistic?
I honestly don't know. I don't know. For whatever reason, my brain is just sort of like yes and no.
There's something a bit off about it, isn't there?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what it is. To me, I think it's maybe the faces.
I think it's my brain also just knows, like, this is art, and it's always put the idea that art is always going to take a license or liberty.
Yeah, that's true. Right. And here's the thing, is that here's the kind of big revelation about Kane and his artwork, is that he's kind of, while he at the time achieved an enormous amount of success, and he would eventually get financing by the Hudson's Bay Company to actually reproduce and continue his work, right, of, capturing, quote unquote, the essence of prairie indigenous populations before they disappeared. He's also known now as someone who did fudge a bit with the truth.
Surprise! Artist fudging with the truth.
Yeah,
damn artists.
Yeah, like I'm pulling this from a book that I read for a class not too long ago called "The Imaginary Indian: The Image of the Indian in Canadian Culture" by Daniel Francis, which is great. And he says this about Kane. He says Kane was a documentary artist, but he worked within certain conventions and manipulated his images to suit the demands of these conventions. Though he was praised for his accuracy, he often added details of setting and landscape to highlight the romantic flavor of the scenes. And he sometimes, quote unquote, cheated by adding clothing and artifacts foreign to the natives in his painting.
That sounds about right.
His most famous, quote unquote, forgery is a depiction of an Assiniboine buffalo hunt, the one we're looking at, which was actually modeled on an Italian engraving of two young men on horseback chasing a bull. Recently, Kane has been accused of exploiting the Indians by using them as, quote, exotic curiosities instead of painting them realistically. And so he goes on to say, actually, he was essentially a tourist among them. He spoke no native languages. He had a superficial understanding of native customs. And despite his sympathy for what he saw to be their plight, he showed little concern for native people after his expedition. And he was surprisingly narrow-minded about many aspects of their culture, which I find kind of interesting to think about, right? The idea of, like, how could I say this? The idea that, you're pandering again to a crowd, right? In this case, right? I do think the Francis in this case makes a really important note of saying, like, he was very much a man of his time in many ways, and not in the ways that would make it so he understood these people, right? He wanted to portray what he thought they were like, right? Because he didn't actually come from these populations and had no idea what they were like, right? Aside from what he saw.
And you say, adding artistic things background. That makes sense. I'm looking at it now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, like, storm clouds almost.
Yeah, there's storm clouds arriving. There's like a weird disconnection where I don't know if this is intentional or not.
It's all very ominous.
Yeah, and like the figures don't really seem to be touching the ground almost.
Yeah.
They seem to be kind of floating. They're a bit like spectral in a sense. And you see this in a lot of his art, I feel, where it's just, there's like this disconnection with reality that's just enough to be like, this is weird in many ways. So his goal, according to himself, right, as he later wrote, he would actually write about his journeys, right? His goal was to, quote, sketch the pictures of the principal chiefs and their original costumes, to illustrate their manners and customs, and to represent the scenery of an almost unknown country. Again, unknown to whom is obvious. But what made him decide to paint the natives, Francis writes, not even his biographer can say for sure. There is no clear evidence to explain Kane's almost instant conversion at this time to the cause of painting natives. It's like, again, Francis takes a cynical route and says, like, basically he saw fame and fortune, and he's like, yep, this is what I'll paint.
This is why.
But to me, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up Paul Kane in particular, and you can find plenty of other artists that were similar at this time. Kane had kind of like someone who studied under him after, called Frederick Arthur Werner, who would do things similar in terms of his art. But what's interesting, and I think the Assiniboine hunting buffalo image also represents this, is that it's very much preserving an image, as the title of the book that I pulled from represents, of the quote unquote imaginary Indian. Natives at this time, in the plains or otherwise, barely looked like this, if at all. Right. And so what I find kind of interesting with this image is, like, as you were saying immediately, is like, oh, there's like an interesting movement to it. There's a dynamic to it, but it's also inherently frozen in an imaginary past. Right? And it captures them in this moment where they never existed.
Oh, neat.
I don't know. Like, that's, again, just me kind of.
No, I like it. And I like this. I feel you're right. His sort of, because we can take the cynical route, and I don't think anybody would bemoan us for taking the cynical route of why he specifically painted First Nations. But I do, as we've seen, like, in a lot of these cases, there was some genuine fascination with this new way of life.
Absolutely.
And there still is, like, white people are still imitating the cultures of other places.
I mean, just look at any festival. You see it all the time of adopting quote unquote indigenous garb by, white people. And you're like, that's weird. Why are you doing this now?
White boys with dreads.
Yeah.
And I think there might have been some genuine just fascination, because this would have been a whole new world and a whole new way of living and ideas for him,
Yeah. And there's an interesting moment again in Francis where he writes about people's responses to his paintings, where he says people flocked to the exhibit to see powerful portraits of native hunters, scenes of the buffalo chase, and depictions of exotic pagan rituals. Critics remarked on the authenticity and exquisite detail of the work. Again, critics who many times had never been to Canada. Right. And quote from one critic, a striking characteristic of Mr. Kane's paintings is their truthfulness. Nothing has been sacrificed to effect. No exaggerated examples of costumes, no incredible distortions of features, which again, if you look at Assiniboine hunting buffalo, is wrong, are permitted to move our wonder or exalt our conceptions of what is sufficiently wild and striking without improvements. Yeah. There was one last point that I wanted to bring up, and I'm trying to look for it specifically.
Take your time. It's okay.
Yeah.
You do you, boo.
Oh, damn. So basically, there was a point in the book where he brings up the fact that when Kane showed these paintings, right, or these sketches to the indigenous populations that he was, painting, and he actually notes, Kane himself notes in his journal something that I think is very interesting here, and I think will kind of lead us directly into the Indian Act next episode. To quote Kane here, "My power of portraying the features of individuals was attributed by the indigenous populations entirely to supernatural agency," reported Kane. "And I found that in looking at my pictures, they always covered their eyes with their hands and looked through their fingers, this being also the invariable custom when looking at a dead person." I find this to be particularly interesting.
I find it interesting.
Thank you. But like, he's on the cusp of something really interesting here, but he doesn't, like, Kane, I don't think realizes what he's talking about, or like the interest of what he's talking about. Like, he's kind of killing a culture when trying to preserve it. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, to me, it's kind of striking. When I read that, I was like, oh man, they consider that to be a dead image. Like, they themselves consider it to be like a demise of some kind. But he doesn't seem to care because it's quote unquote authentic.
And it's authenticity of imagery and art is kind of fascinating in that way, in how we perceive it and how we sort of make it hold that belief. He that's the duality of painting and art, because art gives it life of its own.
Yeah.
But the fact that he's looking at something is like, this is dead. I'm going to paint it, as if not thinking, like, he has the fascination of it, but no desire to preserve it or to conserve it in a living way, just in his own artistic way.
Yeah. But then that also, and I guess I wrote down some questions at the end of the notes of like, what does it mean to depict a culture in this way? It was like, it's kind of interesting in which the image in this case becomes to many people the reality, right? The art that is completely distorted or distorted in many ways becomes the way by which many people imagine, or at least it's a confirmation of their imagination of the quote unquote Indian, right? Which I find troubling, but also very fascinating to think of, where he went in with an assumption and then confirmed that assumption to a lot of people, right, that they had about indigenous populations as backwards and savage in many ways. So it just kind of makes my brain hurt to think about it, but also I can't fault him, like, insofar as like he made some pretty images and they're striking to look at even today, but it's like, at what cost, right? Because, generations of people would be informed by this. Right. And still to this day, a lot of people view Kane's work as authentic. Right. But it's not. So anyway, I kind of rambled on for a bit. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to Kane as an artist, or like the value of art in this place, or like what is like culture in relation to survival? I don't know.
I mean, the whole point of surviving at the end of the day is almost to make culture. Why else? Like, the point of humanity or whatever, you can take it down to a scientific level where we have the instinctual need to fuck and reproduce. Sure. And that's the point of humanity. But if we look at like humans as a species, in the end, we're all just trying to live so we can enjoy things, right? Yeah. Like, we're trying to pursue happiness, and that often comes through culture. So culture and survivability, they're always going to be right next to each other because we survive to make culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're trying to preserve it.
Yeah. Any last thoughts before we cap it off?
No. If you found anything interesting, again, look it up for yourself. Look up the Ghost Dance, look up the Sundance, look up all those things.
Yeah, I'll be linking all of those things that we were referring to in the show notes, as always. And yeah, like as always, especially the first part of the episode, look into actual Indigenous people who are talking about this stuff. Yeah. Right? Because again, they know we have. I'm happy to talk about it, and I think we addressed it in a good way today. But it's always better to go back to the people who know best in this case. So, as always, I encourage you to do that. But yeah, Mac, how can people support us? Ooh, by the way, I wanted to mention we've hit new charts this week.
Ooh, what are the charts?
We're in Japan, Brazil also. Oh. Yeah, we're in the top 50 in Japan somehow.
Nice.
On Apple Podcasts. I was like, oh, interesting. In the Dominican Republic, we're top 50 in Brazil, top 150 in Brazil. So I was like, okay, interesting. We're hitting it big time, baby.
Woo! International recognition.
But yeah, so next week we're recording an episode of Pop Canada. But Mac, where can they find that episode of Pop Canada once it releases?
Over on our Patreon account.
Hell yeah.
And yeah, you can find it on Patreon. If you want to support us in other ways, send us an email, drop a like. I don't know. What do the kids say? Comment and subscribe.
Like, comment, subscribe. Smash that like button.
Ring the bell for notifications.
But obviously any support is helpful. Send a review, do anything, even send an email. You can donate through PayPal if you want. All that is in the show notes. So honestly, thank you everyone just for listening is always great. And, tell friends about us, right? If you like the show, if you hate the show, doesn't matter, right? Tell someone about it. Make it your mission to do something during your spring break. Tell one person about the podcast. There you go.
There you go.
And like us on social media or do whatever. I don't know. Just, have fun. Enjoy life. Don't let your anxieties get to you.
Yeah.
I think that's where I'll end off. Honestly, thank you everyone for listening. And next episode in 2 weeks, the Indian Act, which is a profound response to a lot of the stuff that we were talking about today. Fun. Anyway, see y'all next time. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.